All right, let me let a couple more people in and we can go ahead and get started here. My computer will work. Come on. There we go. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eleanor Rangers. I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We are a nonprofit that's been in existence since 2010 in the Southeastern Pennsylvania area, dedicated to, well, we originally started out collecting oral histories of people involved in Cold War related activities, but over the years, our scope has really expanded into things like what we have here this evening, which is educational webinars primarily focused on the Cold War, but we also delve into the space race as well occasionally. So I have a couple of introductory remarks before we introduce this evening's speaker. As many of you know, this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series. It started out as live lectures that we conducted in Warminster at the former site of the Naval Air Development Center in 2012. During COVID, we switched over to webinars, and that proved to be pretty successful. So we've really continued that format. We have gone back to doing some limited live programming in Warminster. So if you are local to that area, we would encourage you to attend those events when they're announced. As a 501c3, I have to give the inevitable plug that donations are always welcome if you so choose to donate to organizations like ourselves. These types of events always help to support folks coming in from out of town, transcriptions of interviews, website maintenance, and displays. And one example of why support actually is useful, we actually had the opportunity to have logbooks from the centrifuge at Johnsville transcribed. And now we have a digital log primarily focused on the space race training runs that occurred between the late 1950s through the mid 1960s. And we actually had a gentleman by the name of Danny Parker reach out to us within the last year, who is working on a new book with about Scott Carpenter, who trained at Johnsville. And he, you know, our log books have been very helpful to him in supporting some of his research activities related to that book. In addition, we had a woman in Ireland actually contact us some time ago who turned out to be a distant relative of a former employee of the Naval Air Development Center, who I have spoken about many times, Alice Stoll. Alice is big claim to fame is that she actually helped to operationalize Nomex, fire retardant material, as a replacement for nylon in pilots' uniforms. Of course, Nomex has gone on to have quite an ubiquitous history, being utilized as a fire retardant material in many different materials. And most recently, we actually were able to submit a successful nomination for Alice to be inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in Washington, D.C. If I may ask, anyone who is not muted, can you please mute so we can avoid any extraneous sound in the background? Thank you. Another thing that your donations have gone to is helping to support the development of a display room that we actually have at the old Johnsville Centrifuge building. These are some shots from my iPhone of our display that is now pretty much complete. The only thing other thing I want to do right now is maybe try to hang some model aircraft from the ceiling, probably a P3, maybe a P2 and some others. But if you are in the Warminster area, we would encourage you to definitely attend, check out this display. It is dedicated to the Naval Air Development Center. So certainly a prominent part of the display involves the P3 Orion, because as many of you know, Warminster was the site where the P3 was developed, tested, tested, and eventually upgrades were managed out of Warminster. We also have a YouTube channel, and we do record these webinars and post them on YouTube. I do try to keep this channel updated with some other Cold War related videos that I happen to stumble across on YouTube. So it's definitely good to check out the channel periodically because we do try to add new content there. We also have a Facebook page. If any of you are on that platform, you can check us out there as well. I do try to put the announcements for programming on the Facebook page and occasionally some Cold War related news items and miscellany of interest. So that's another way to reach out to us as well if you so choose. And something else I want to also mention that I don't talk about too much, but a couple of years ago, we actually started up another website called the Southeastern Pennsylvania Veterans Virtual Wall of Honor Project. And there, believe it or not, there was nothing that was done specifically for Southeastern PA veterans on the web. So we decided to start up this Wall of Honor, virtual Wall of Honor, and you can submit bios of, either of yourself or of family members or acquaintances that are from the Southeastern PA area, either born in that area or, currently or have resided in the past. So we certainly would enjoy the opportunity to host those biographies on there if you have interest in that. And we do have a whole host of presentations, as I had mentioned, throughout the course of the year. We're up to June, of course, halfway through the year at this point. But we do have another, half of the year of events coming up, including, again, for those of you who may be close to the Warminster area, July 20th, we are doing an open house with a speaker program to commemorate what will be the 65th anniversary of the beginning of Project Mercury centrifuge training at Johnsville, as well as, of course, the 55th anniversary of Apollo 11 that day. So we certainly would love to say hello if you happen to be able to stop by on the 20th. And you can see the other programs that we have scheduled through the balance of the year. So definitely looking forward to that remaining docket for 2024. And also on the line this evening as well is one of our audience members, David Stumpf, who has spoken for us several times on this webinar, will be joining us to talk about another topic of his next book that is getting ready to be published on hit-to-kill missile defense. So he will be joining us on July 11th, actually a week before our open house event in Warminster. And there it is again, the event that's in Warminster. So we do have an Eventbrite page up as well. I will be starting to send some notifications out through our email distribution list. So if you want to learn more about that, to definitely be able to link to the Eventbrite page for more details. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker this evening, Christopher Drew. He is an investigative reporter for the New York Times and a co-author of Blind Man's Bluff, a best-selling book about submarine spying during the Cold War. He won a George Polk Award with other Times journalists for articles in 2015 revealing how the Navy SEAL teams became a global manhunting machine with little outside oversight. He teaches investigative reporting at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, and he has worked for the Times in Washington and New York since 1995. He was the projects editor for the Metropolitan Desk when the September 11 attacks occurred. He spent the next 7 years an assistant editor for the Times Investigative Unit, where he coordinated terrorism coverage and other stories. He reported on the efforts of his hometown, New Orleans, to recover from Hurricane Katrina and dug into the backgrounds of Barack Obama and other presidential candidates. Mr. Drew has also reported for the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, and New Orleans Times-Picayune. And during 10 years in Washington, he twice won awards for national reporting from the White House Correspondents Association. And Blind Man's Bluff, the untold story of American submarine espionage, was on the hardcover and paperback bestseller lists for nearly a year. 60 Minutes and the History Channel based shows on the book, which won the Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt Naval History Prize and honors from investigative reporters and editors. So quite a resume, Chris. So I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn things over to you.
Well, thanks, Eleanor. I'm really impressed with everything you do here and that list of speakers and programs you have. It's just amazing. So I wanted to start out by taking us back, if you're a little bit older like I am, even if you still feel younger, go back to sort of the mid 1970s. And we started Blind Man's Bluff. We started the book with an anecdote of the USS Seawolf, which was one of 4 submarines over time that were specially equipped to tap into Soviet cables and to recover missile parts from test missiles. And Seawolf had just gotten back in the mid-70s from one of these missions, and Captain Charles McVane was sound asleep at 2 a.m., catching up on his sleep, and he gets a call from the Navy in Washington, and the officer asks him if he knows of a bar called the Horse and Cow, which is where the men would have a send-off before they headed out on these missions on the West Coast, and where they'd celebrate when they got back. And he said, there's one of your sailors who's in a phone booth outside the bar, and he's trying to call the president to tell him what a great job you just did and how great you are. And could you please go get him out of the phone booth? So by the time McVane and his chief got over there, the guy's still in the phone booth, still trying to talk his way past the White House operator to get to the president. And McVane then goes and buys him a beer. We started the book like that because as we worked on it for 7 years, we were just really impressed and really moved by all the men who did this, the families that supported them. It's such a great group of people, colorful people, innovative people, daring people who participated in the Cold War under the sea. And a lot of you know that from your roles in it. So there's a lot of action, a lot of drama in the book. A lot of reviewers called it True Life Hunt for Red October. And we trace the development of the submarine and the anti-submarine missions, and trace how the technology got more sophisticated, how things changed. But at heart, the book is really about the people who kept pioneering new and better ways to counter the Soviet threats as they grew and changed over the Cold War. And so we kind of viewed the story in 3 main phases. If you think about the time after World War II in the late 40s, instantly US was worried, allies were worried. What were the Soviets going to do with the German technology they obtained, including the snorkel submarine? Were they developing nuclear weapons, missiles? And very quickly, submariners realized they could transform what they did from World War II, as you know, where submarines were basically surface ships that would dive for relatively short periods of time to attack surface ships, into something stealthier, something, using this snorkel technology that came from Germany, into a vessel that could hang off the Soviet coast and both watch for developments, check out the capabilities of new submarines and ships, collect electronic intelligence. So we open, the first chapter in the book is about the Kachina, which in 1949 was given a rudimentary black box to go not too far from the Soviet Union, really sort of at the Norway end of Norway, see if they could pick up any electronic signs of Soviet missile tests. And as it was, fire broke out. It was a horrible story. 7 men died on the Kachino and the companion ship. The XO was burned. terribly, and the captain finally was the last man to abandon ship, got just across the plank from the Kachino to the other submarine, the Tusk, just as the thing broke and the submarine sank. So it wasn't a very propitious beginning, but that didn't deter anybody. You know, today that might be the end of the program, you know, but back then, everybody was just, you know, the needs were so great, the fears were so great that the Soviets were going to start flooding submarines, advanced submarines, and come off the US coast, that lots of diesel subs with snorkels, we started sending them off the Soviet coast. And you could picture the men in the old diesel subs, and they're crammed in there, and they've got the shower filled with food, potatoes, whatever, and they've got to come up and snorkel and clear the air. And so we tell the story about the USS Gudgeon in 1957 that got detected by the Soviets off the port of Vladivostok and held down for 48 hours or more as the air got worse, and then finally had to surface amid the Soviet warships. And in the Morse code exchanges that followed, the Soviets ended up saying, "Thanks for the ASW exercise," before they let the Gudgeon go. So things, as you can imagine, were pretty rough in the diesel era. Once we got the nuclear subs, and I'm going to talk more about this as we go along, we got to a period that we considered sort of the greatest sea hunts. Once the Soviets were developing missile subs and sending them out into the Atlantic, and the US and the Brits, we had to know where they were. And, you know, the biggest focus really came down to how do you prevent another Pearl Harbor in a nuclear age. Nobody wanted to be surprised by these missile subs, first diesel ones and then nuclear powered ones. And that's where those of you involved with SOSUS P3 Orions, you know, the whole detection system that was set up to find the Soviet subs coming through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And we'll talk in a little bit about the USS Lapon in 1969, which trailed the first Yankee class submarine for 47 days in the Atlantic to figure out where its operating area was, where it was going to hide, what its characteristics were. And that trail started because SOSUS picked up the sounds of that. And then the third area I felt as we did the book was sort of exploiting the deep sea for intelligence, for the first recovering test missile parts to try to learn more about the Soviet missile capabilities. Then the cable tapping to really give a glimpse inside their minds and their plans and what they were planning to do. And amazing, all those were amazing achievements. And so we can talk about that. But we felt the book kind of progressed through those three periods. And when you think that we calculated there were probably at least 2,000 missions where diesel or nuclear submarines were just hanging off the coast, hanging off Soviet ports, sort of like cops on a beat, just watching to see what, you know, what was happening. Every time a new class of Soviet subs or ships would come out, our submarines would be checking them out to get the sound signatures for the SOSUS system so we could recognize their submarines at sea. Some submarines did what was called underhulling, you know, right there in the Barents Sea, going underneath the Soviet subs at very close quarters to capture the sounds of the propellers, so that we'd have that information to help locate them later. And ultimately, you know, when we got to the cable tapping, you know, those submarines were letting out divers right along the Soviet coast. So, you know, people on those missions describe here in the Soviet warships right overhead, saturation divers working at 400 feet or so deep, you know, knowing that the Soviet warships were right overhead. Men on those subs talked about practicing self-destruct drills on the way over because they weren't supposed to be caught, and they would have an escort sub to protect them just in case. How many of you have read the book? Yeah, what interested you the most, Kevin? I think you're muted.
Probably the discussion about the GUIK gap and everything, because I used to fly up there
Okay.
in 1974.
Okay. And what, so I'm sure, do you remember the chapter about the Lapon and Whitey Mack?
Not off the top of my head, because I've read the book quite several years ago and everything.
Yeah. It's hard to believe it came out almost 26 years ago.
Yeah.
If you believe it. But you know, that was one of my favorite chapters. He was that was in the late 60s, and that's when the Yankee class submarines were coming out, and you know, the best Soviet missile subs to that point. And there was a great fear, you know, that they could be 1,000 miles off Washington or New York and hit the US. And we didn't know where they, you know, where they were operating, where they were hiding. And so there was a huge premium on trying to follow one. And so other submariners had spotted them. A sub called the Greenling had done the underhulling and picked up the sounds, taped the sounds of a Yankee in the Barents Sea. Whitey Mack had photographed one on the Lapon, but nobody had been able to trail it. And so it was the SOSUS system that picked up the first signs of it. And the Lapon was out there, and the Lapon was sent toward the gap to try to pick it up and follow it. And I think they lost contact several times, regained contact, lost it again, and they decided to take a chance and head down by the Azores and wait for it to get down there. And after getting tangled up in some fishing net and having to surface and cut away the net, you know, they thought they had really blown it. And then I think it was 12 hours after the incident with the net, they heard the sound and were able to get in and start to trail. And that's where, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have seen The Hunt for Red October, and you know from personal experience, but the Crazy Ivan maneuver. And so, you know, you couldn't, it didn't do you any good to be right in the baffles anyway, because you couldn't pick up anything. But the Lapon was doing what they called a close-in trail, staying about 3,000 yards back. And pretty soon, I mean, they could hear most everything on the Yankee. I mean, every time there was a machinery noise or something like that. And the guys on the Lapon over time even assigned names to the officer of the deck as they shifted, because different ones had different tendencies. And so they learned to stay a little bit off, because in the middle of the trail, suddenly the Yankee turned around and came roaring back in that Crazy Ivan maneuver. And they went for, I think it was 47 days. They stayed behind it. At the time, intelligence officials thought Yankees might have to come within 700 miles of the US coast to fire their missiles, but this one stayed further away, like 1,200 to 1,400 miles, leading to some conjecture that the missiles were a little longer range than we thought. But we knew exactly, where it was going to hide. It never detected the Lapon behind it. And Whitey Mack was quite a character. He was 6'6", 240 pounds. And he'd pulled all kind of connections and whatnot to assemble an all-star crew to try to, beat out other guys who came from, tonier backgrounds, like later Admiral Ken McKee, who was one of the hot runners in the Atlantic at the time, and to try to get past them and pull this off, which he did. But some of you may have heard, like I say, it was the interesting thing to us as we got into this, meeting a lot of these people, seeing how interesting the people were. Tommy Cox was on board the Lapon. He was one of the spooks, one of the Russian linguists, and he was also the guitar playing, song recording spook. I don't know if any of you have heard some of his songs, but one of them was Torpedo in the Water, about a time that Whitey Mack had taken the Lapon right into the middle of a live torpedo exercise and was having to outrun the torpedo. And another one was the Ballad of Whitey Mack, after he'd done all this. And there was a line in the song that said, "In this game of blind man's bluff, we always knew he'd pull us through." So that ended up being one of the things that gave rise to our title. The other thing was, I was interviewing Admiral McKee at one point, and he said, after all, submarining's always been a game of blind man's bluff. And so those couple of things, just again, to come back and for the SOSUS people and the P3 people, I mean, to explain to the average person, I mean, all you've got is the sound to rely on, no vision, obviously, and interpreting the sonar and all the other sounds. And so once we heard the term blind man's bluff, and in the song and in the interview with McKee, that suddenly became instantly, what a great title, right? And so that's how that title came about. But I wonder, so the captains in that period, late 60s, early 70s, to me, that was kind of the most exciting period, because they were going in close, they were taking chances. The submarines had what they called paravis, where they could share with the crew what they were seeing through the periscope if they wanted to. So the crew members would, rate the captains, whether they were daring or they had names like Chicken of the Sea for ones that wouldn't go in close and try to get intelligence. And so it was all very, had to be pretty carefully calibrated, because you could easily set off the kind of confrontation that you were trying to avoid through this intelligence gathering. I mean, there were more than a dozen collisions of Soviet and US and British subs over the years. And Joe was saying at the beginning, he was on board for one of those, the Tautog, not too long after the Lapon's success. The Tautog was off on the Pacific side, and tracking a Soviet Echo 2 submarine, not too far from it was doing its exercises, and people on board, and we talked to Joe. We talked to about a dozen people who were on the Tautog, and we talked to lots of other officials who heard the sonar tapes. And the Echo was doing angles and dangles, other kind of training maneuvers. And the Tautog's captain was saying, here she comes, there she goes. And it's going back and forth. And then finally, smashes into the sail of the Tautog. And people, heard these grinding sounds, these sounds of the metal ripping apart. And, the Tautog was damaged, making noise of its own, but didn't hang around to find out what happened to the Soviet sub. They wanted to get out of there and get a safer distance. And many people, experts all the way up in the Navy, concluded that the sounds on the sonar tape were the Soviet sub sinking. And in fact, we talked to sonar men, we talked to people at SubPac, we talked to Admiral Small, I think, who was the head of SubPac at the time. We talked to Admiral Moore, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We talked to Melvin Laird, who was the defense secretary, and every one of them said it was reported to them that we thought the Soviet sub had sunk. And Melvin Laird told me that he briefed President Nixon on it, that we thought in this collision the Soviet sub had sunk. And I asked him, well, what did President Nixon say? And he said nothing. He just listened, didn't say anything. And so this project started when I was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, and we did a series of stories, I think came out in 1992, and came out right around the same time that the Persian Gulf War, the first week of the war, so nobody really paid attention to these stories. And it was the first time I'd done a big series that I'd spent months and months on, where I felt like we just scratched the surface. There was so much here. We had gotten into the subject because if you remember, when the Berlin Wall fell and Bush and Gorbachev were saying the Cold War was over, and the Hunt for Red October had just hit the movie screen. So we really just kind of got into this thinking maybe this is a moment where some of the stories that couldn't be told before could be told now. And the Hunt for Red October was really popular. And so, how much of this was true, what really happened under the sea, because, spy planes would get shot down, Francis Gary Powers, we knew a lot about that, but nobody knew too much about what had happened under the sea. So that's how we got into this and started interviewing people. And so we'd included the essence of what happened in the Tautog collision in the stories in the Chicago Tribune. So as we were working on the book, I hired a military journalist in Russia to talk to Russian Navy officials. And so this is the early 90s. They were pretty much more open, at least for a few years there. And so he ended up finding the captain of the Russian sub that the Tautog collided with. And to make sure that it was legit, I didn't give him the location, the date, the time, certain aspects. I just mentioned there had been this collision, and then he interviewed the Russian captain, and basically everything he got from him, without knowing the specifics of what we had, matched up with the two, time, place, whatnot. But the Russian captain described basically being saved by their double hull construction, that they started to sink. They were blowing ballast, nothing was happening. He said his engineering officer collapsed to the deck, paralyzed, couldn't get up out of fear. And then finally they were able to blow themselves to the surface. He said the whole way back to port, the engineering officer remained, down on the deck, unable to move. And he described the hole in the side of the outer hull as being the size of a trolley car, but their inner hull held, and that's how they survived. So it was really fascinating because, I mean, you could imagine all the sonar experts who listened to the sonar tapes and made the conclusion that it sounded like the other sub had sunk, to the point where it would get briefed all the way to President Nixon. So that was one of the fascinating stories in the book. Joe, how much did you know at the time of what happened? See if Joe's still there.
Yeah, no, we were in trail of the Echo 2 for several weeks and following them, and did that, and they came back when we had the collision. We knew we hit him with our sail, so we had to go down deep to clear the wreckage, and then we exited the area as fast as, cleared Datum as fast as possible. We listened to all the tapes, we listened to all that, and concluded that he did not sink. And later, that came true when the captain of the K-108, the Black Lila, as you mentioned,
Right.
came up and he was interviewed and so on. So
Yeah.
it was obviously a very traumatic and scary time for the ship, as you can imagine. So
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And, the hard thing about this kind of reporting, since we weren't there, you talk to people, you talk to as many people as you can. Like I said, we talked about a dozen people on the Tautog, and, as Joe knows, depending on where you were on the boat, what your job was, what differs greatly, and certain people know a lot more than other people. But as hard as it was to find out about some of the things that happened, getting that kind of you are there detail to recreate it, largely as it happened, in a dramatic way, and to get those kind of details, takes a lot of work, a lot of talking to people. And again, we're going by people's memories. There aren't any documents to consult. So who feel free to ask any questions you have as we're talking. Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
Well, not so much a question. I just wanted to let you know, I think you asked earlier who had read the book, and I was kind of off the screen for a moment, but I read your book, and I had the book in front of me. And
Great.
it was fascinating. I mean, I read it many years ago, so I can't remember much of it, but my favorite part
Right.
was the tapping of the cable.
Mm-hmm.
So are you going to talk about that in any detail?
Yeah, let me talk about that. I'll say first, it was fascinating that back in the early 60s, there was already a realization by people in the Navy that going down to the deep, if we could develop the technology and get there, that there was a lot of intelligence. And it was first focused on, okay, there's these test missile warheads, these guidance systems. If we could recover them, we could learn a lot about their missile capabilities. And so the Halibut was one of the Regulus subs. And as Rickover was bringing in all the nuclear subs, he wasn't going to give up a new sub for something like exploratory intelligence in the deep. So he finally handed over the Halibut, which became the first special project sub. And some of the guys who were later involved in the initial cable tapping missions on it said they took a little comfort that if they got detected, the Russians would probably never think it was an American sub, as loud as it was, this old, originally a Regulus sub. But one of the first successes it had was finding the Gulf submarine that went down that much later, you know, the CIA tried to raise through the Howard Hughes Glomar Explorer operation. And when that went down in 1968, the Soviets were looking in one area, and the US didn't know at first where it went down, but figured out where it went down because the Soviets would do these microburst transmissions at 3 distinct spots on every submarine mission as they headed toward their operating areas off Hawaii. And they went back and found that this one did the first transmission, but didn't do the second. And they knew where they normally did the second when they crossed the international date line. And then our guys went back through the SOSUS tapes and found a small sound, not a big one, a pop, and did some triangulation and thought it might have sunk, might have been on the surface and had hatches open, a lot of hatches open, most hatches open, and somehow flooded. And the sound was not that big a sound because maybe there were only a hatch or two still shut. So we actually sacrificed a diesel sub of our own, flooded it, taped the sounds, and used that to kind of confirm that this was the likely location, sent the halibut out. It had cameras that it could dangle about 20,000 feet and scour the bottom, and finally located the Gulf submarine at the bottom in this area where the triangulation had suggested it would be. Got 22,000 pictures of it, including one of a Soviet sailor's skeleton in a foul weather coat that added to the thinking that the sub had been on the surface, maybe had a battery explosion. And so that success, those pictures were shared with the Nixon White House and whatnot. That's what led to the Glomar Explorer mission. So Captain James Bradley, who was in charge of submarine intelligence at the time and was heavily involved in that, had been thinking there must be Soviet cables that could be tapped, especially on the Pacific side, you know, from the Kamchatka Peninsula, perhaps across the Sea of Okhotsk, you know, to take messages back to Moscow. And so he was trying to figure out where would we find these cables if they existed. And we describe how he was in his office at the Pentagon at 3 a.m. one night, thinking back on his boyhood in St. Louis and how he would love to go on the Mississippi River boats and, you know, just hang around with the pilots, head down the Mississippi River. And suddenly he just remembered, you know, every time he's out on these river boats, you'd pass these signs that said, cable crossing, do not anchor. And he thought, you know, there must be a sign in Russian on a beach where these cables come out into the water, because they're not going to want to risk these cables getting snagged and damaged. And so basically on that boyhood memory and that sort of 3 a.m. dream, he sent the halibut into the Sea of Okhotsk looking for a sign on the beach that said cable crossing, you know, in Russian, do not anchor. And eventually they found one, and then they followed the cable out and put the first tap on 40 miles or so out into the sea. So that started an amazing mission that 4 submarines in succession did, first in that desolate sea, and then later when we had a newer sub, the Parchi, become the special project sub and a much quieter sub. They started tapping over near Murmansk, where it was much more dangerous and much more active. And there were a lot of close calls the USS Seawolf, which was the second sub to do this, got stuck on the bottom of the Sea of Akkad at one point. A storm had come up, and when they were doing the tapping at the time, they had put some legs on the sub. They called them skegs. They were like ski legs, so that it could sit there and be secure while the divers were out and not suck up all kind of gunk, into the intakes and the engines. And the storm knocked it off the skegs, and it took all these rocks and things in, and couldn't lift itself, couldn't blow ballast, couldn't push itself, power itself off the seabed for a day or two, until it finally broke free. And so it wasn't too long after that, that was in 1980-81, that the Soviets sent a cable laying ship into that sea and recovered our tap pod. So then the big question was, how did they find out? And a lot of people feared that the Seawolf had inadvertently given it away when it fell, that it might have sent some kind of surge or something through the cable. And ultimately, Rich Haver, who was a Navy analyst, naval intelligence analyst, noticed that this cable laying ship that the Russians had sent over there to check it out and find that the tap pod had actually left its port and had started heading over there before the Seawolf fell on the cable. And so for the period of time, he was arguing there must be a leak, there must be a spy, and nobody really wanted to believe him. And then if you remember, Ronald Pelton was caught, and he was an NSA analyst who knew where that tap pod was, and for 35, he had gone into the Soviet embassy in Washington, and for $35,000 told them about the cable tap, and so gave it away for $35,000. So ultimately, the cable taps on the Barents Sea side were much more important. And people said that in 1983, when there was that what was called the Able Archer exercise, and the Soviets mistakenly thought Reagan might attack, they went into their nuclear war posture, and that was the period when they had begun hiding their missile subs under the ice. And so we were able to, on that tap, collect some of these dispersal orders and whatever, to know better what their plans were in terms of a nuclear war. So one thing, by the end of everything, what was interesting was the US always had a technological advantage. Our subs were quieter, better. But at the end, the Soviets were tactically putting themselves in a good position once they were able to have long enough missile ranges that they could hide their missile subs under the ice. And the funny thing is that, as secret as it all was, and as much as that was at stake, through the cable tapping, US Navy learned an incredible amount about what the Soviets were trying to do, and from trailing their subs and whatnot. But through Johnny Walker and Ronald Pelton, these two spies, the Soviets were basically getting inside our minds, as it were. And Walker and his ring had given them all the ciphers and the way to intercept so many communications, told them about how to quiet their subs, how we quieted our subs. They started quieting their subs. So in the end, it was this big secretive standoff, but both sides actually knew a lot more about what the other was up to than the public realized at the time. on our side because of the cable, taps on their side because of these spies they were able to recruit. So I don't know. Do you think that maybe some people think that helps stabilize things and keep it from getting out of hand because both sides knew enough about the other to show some restraint? Because when there were times when they dropped depth charges, when they caught our spy subs, and like I said, there were a dozen or more collisions, most of them in the Barents Sea. But whereas the Soviets, in the 50s and 60s were shooting down spy planes, sometimes when they dropped the depth charges, they were just half power depth charges. I don't know if it was sort of an unwritten brotherhood of the deep sea, or the fact that, the submarines were hidden under the sea and it didn't feel as intrusive as spy planes flying over, but it never got as hot a war, as frenetic as it was, as what happened with the spy planes. I don't know. Do you all have any thoughts about that? Kevin, you look like you're thinking about it. Anybody have any questions or other things in particular you want to talk about?
Excuse me.
Yeah, Gwen?
Christopher, do you mention in your book much about SOSUS in the 60s?
You cut out a little bit. Mention about SOSUS, about what? In the what?
During the early 1960s.
We don't have a great detailed account. I mean, we have the sense of it developing and spreading and what the main goals were, and how it assisted the submarines like the Lapon, but we don't tell the story as fully as it could be. Has somebody told the SOSUS story well? Have you come across a book that tells it well?
Well, that's when I worked with the SOSUS system in Nova Scotia. I was at the base from 1960, April 1963 till the end of August 1965.
Mm-hmm.
And we changed shifts every 3 days, and I did that for almost 2.5 years.
Wow.
So yeah.
And you changed because it was just so intense manning the
Well, it was
station.
a 24-hour operation.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
That's amazing. There was a study by a contractor named, I think it was R.F. Cross, of SOSUS and ASW in the 60s that was declassified, and we found in the operational archives at the Navy Yard that had some history. But it's just fascinating to think about what you all did, and of course then later what computers could do in monitoring things. One reason I felt like with the submarines that the 1960s, late 1960s, early 70s were the most interesting period, was not that, through the end of the Cold War, our submarines weren't doing the same kind of stuff. And after the Cold War, keeping an eye on China and other people as they, their navies developed. But you didn't, because of the technology improving, you didn't have to go as close to collect as much information, right? In the 60s, you had to get really close and take real chances to get some of this information. And then the standoff distances got greater over time because, the sensors could pick up more from further away. So still, great intelligence being collected, but it didn't quite require, when you think that with the submarines, radio silence, captains in their mid to late 30s out there by themselves, off the Soviet coast, nobody to consult with if the Soviets gave chase, if they'd had a collision, whatever, it's pretty amazing that nothing too bad really happened, because you couldn't run it up the chain of command. What should I do next? You were out there by yourself. Who else has a question?
We actually have one in the chat. And I think he just may have left the meeting, but nevertheless, his question is, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. However, do people think the loss of the Scorpion was in fact an accident? So that may be a more general question to the group.
Yeah, well, I think it was an accident. I don't buy any of the theories that some people have that the Soviets sank it. And I say that because in reporting on the book, the Scorpion had checked out some Soviet balloon activity around the Azores and had left and was heading home for a couple of days. And before, the tragedy happened. And some of the people we talked to for the book were intelligence officials in charge of submarine intelligence who had sent the Scorpion to check out the balloon activity and who had gotten, the messages after that of what it had found, that it was all clear, knew how far away it was. I mean, there was never any sign, that the Soviets were following it. And, we had a theory in the book. There were problems with our torpedoes at the time and could have been a hot running torpedo. The more prevailing theory in the Navy is that it had a battery explosion of some kind. But the reason I think for the Soviet theory was that, it came after the Gulf submarine sunk in the Pacific, the one that we later tried to recover with the Howard Hughes operation. And the Soviets had seen one of our attack subs going into Japan with a damaged sail right before that. And so they concluded that, or they tried to argue that maybe our submarine had run into the Gulf submarine and that's why it sunk. Although I talked to the captain of our submarine and he insisted they had just hit a piece of ice in the Sea of Japan, and that there wasn't any more to it than that. But there arose this sort of theory that because they thought that maybe our submarine had run into the Gulf submarine and that's why it sunk, that they were going to take retribution on the Scorpion. But I've never believed that, just because of the people I talked to who were involved with the Scorpion and the intelligence mission right before that.
And I think Scott Sherrick has a question. And
Okay.
Scott,
Well,
you want to unmute?
yeah, hopefully I have audio here.
Yes, you do.
Super. Oh, well, thank you, Eleanor, again for another great presentation.
I can't take credit for it.
Oh, come on. You bring it together, and there's a whole lot of folks here that share a similar background to me and an affection for the subject matter. Chris, thank you very much for your time. I'm curious, and it's a little bit of a change of subject, maybe a conversation sparker. When you look at the body of work around military and prognostication of what the next generation is going to be as far as combat, FX Holden has his thing going on, and a number of other authors, and Clancy, even in retrospect, had theirs. If you were to write a kind of a history of the future as opposed to history of the history. I'm curious, where would you be on that? You're knowledgeable and really appreciate the comment, and I'm done. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I mean, my biggest fear would be if we ever went to war with China, that first thing they would do would be to knock out all the space satellites, which would then, cripple us, since, everything runs through these satellites, right? So, we would try to go in with F-22s and F-35s and take out, their defenses and some of their things. They would go for our satellites. Maybe we would go for their satellites. They would go for Guam. I mean, one hopes it never comes to that, just because they own so much of our debt. One hopes that they would never, do that to themselves financially. But then again, and Putin doesn't have the resources, especially after being bogged down. But it was so fascinating because in the early 90s, we worked on the book part-time for 7 years, and right after the Cold War ended, a lot of people were reluctant to talk too much because everybody feared that the Soviet Union would flip back, Russia would flip back toward the Soviet Union. And then as the years went by, and with Yeltsin and stories of Russian submarines rusting on the shore, and nuclear reactors dumped in the Barents Sea, and Russian sailors living on old abandoned subs because they didn't have anywhere to put them, people felt like, okay, this really is over, and it was time to talk about what you guys and Gwen and others did. And and then here we are with Putin at this stage, and back to this kind of Cold War situation developing, at least with what's going on in Ukraine and whether there's a threat to go into NATO. But it would seem like the Chinese, and then the other thing is whatever happens with AI, and whether people turn that into swarms of AI guided weapons. It's sort of like, I wrote a lot about drones in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I've been out to the places in Nevada and Arizona where we fly the drones. You can see them on the screen and you can nail them. And so, we moved quickly. We had the advantage there. Now we have to worry about other people using drones against us and our allies, right? So.
Yeah, well, thank you. I thank you for your commentary on that. It's interestingly charged subject, for us. I think, and forgive my presumption here, but those of us that were techie in the P3 era, and there's a lot of us here, of course, because of Eleanor's connection with NavAir in that respect. I come from another community in addition to the P3s. I come from the TACAMO community. But all of us that were techs, on whether it was TACAMO or P3s, none of us, I think, of a certain age would even have envisioned the world of swarms of drones and AI considerations. I follow this subject, and it's amazing. So I'm going to ask one more question on that, because we have a lot of P3 vets here. What do you think of the Poseidon, the P8? And interestingly enough, it was originally touted as being able to fly at airline altitudes to do its mission, and now it's back down against the water like us P3 guys. And I'm actually kind of excited about that.
And why is that? I mean, I remember following it when it came out, but I haven't followed it more recently.
It's just because it makes no sense to hunt ships and submarines from 5,000 feet with a camera. You got to do that close to the bloody water. That's all there is to it, man. Yeah, but thanks again, and thanks for letting me ramble for a moment there. I appreciate your time. Enjoyed the book. And Eleanor, thanks for bringing it together.
Oh, no
Okay.
problem. Chris, I have a question. What was the biggest thing that surprised you in researching this book? And I'm also curious about when the book came out. Um, did you get any blowback from the DoD about it at all? I'm just curious about sort of what happened in the wake of it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, we had done a series for the Chicago Tribune that had some of the things in it, and the Navy, the CNO at the time, had given us a letter cooperating, and then they later revoked that. And the top PR admiral sent out a cable to all Navy bases around the world saying not to talk to us because we were using questionable methods. And when I went in to see him and said, well, what the hell do you mean by that? You know, because I knew him pretty well. And he says, well, you're asking questions, aren't you? That was what his questionable methods was. But then, you know, basically, we were interested in the Cold War history. We weren't trying to bring it up to the current moment. And over time, a lot of the high level officials, I mean, not only admirals, but CIA, former national security advisors, people thought, you know, again, as we got further away from the collapse of the Soviet Union, that so many men had sacrificed so much, you know, the families didn't even know what they did when they came home at book signings. We would meet, like, I met some wives of some of these divers who were off Murmansk tapping into cables, and they had no idea what their husbands had been doing out there until the book came out. And lots of people telling us, you know, they brought the book home and said, okay, well, you want to know what I was doing all those years, read this. And so it kind of, and, you know, there was the Top Gun movie, and then submariners made bottom gun hats and blind man's bluff hats. And there was a certain feeling, and the submarine budget was getting cut at that point, you know, with the peace dividend after the Cold War. So pretty quickly it ended up being embraced by a lot of people in the Navy as, you know, having our story told. And if more people in Congress and elsewhere knew what we did, you know, they won't keep cutting the number of submarines as much as they were, you know, in the late 90s when the book came out. So it was sort of like, I think the first book signing I did was in Norfolk, and I looked up, there was a long line of people, and there were a bunch of guys in uniforms. And when the first guy got up to me, he said, you know, we were out on an exercise and we just came back today. And as we were getting off the boat, some officer was standing there handing us a piece of paper that said there's a new book out about submarines, and if anybody asks you about it, you can neither confirm nor deny. So the sailor said, so as soon as we got that, we knew it must be a pretty good book, so we're all over here to buy a copy. So, you know, that was how it was.
Wow. Any other questions from the group? Don't be shy.
So what else should we be, what other stories should we be telling that haven't been told?
Well, that's what I was going to ask too. I mean, it seems like there's room for another book, a sequel to Blind Man's Bluff.
I always thought I would have done it. You know, it came out in 1998, and then we were thinking about something when 9/11 happened, and then I ended up in charge of a lot of the terrorism coverage for several years. And then I did do a story, must have been around 2005, about the USS San Francisco, which ran aground and hit an undersea mountain while going at a pretty high speed in the Pacific. And I mean, it wasn't, you know, a wartime thing, so it lacked that tension, but I did go out to Guam, and the Navy did make arrangements. I got to interview about 15 crew members, and it was an amazingly dramatic tale. One man died, but all the efforts they made to save him and get him off the submarine and take care of him and to save the submarine. It was an amazing story. So you can Google the story, which ran in the New York Times in, I guess, 2005. Mooney was the name of the captain, if you Google it, in San Francisco. And I was going to do a book about that and use that as a vehicle to kind of write what submarines were doing post-Cold War, because it was stationed at Guam because we had, started stationing subs at Guam at that point, because now we're interested in China and watching China. And but then right when I was going to do that, Katrina happened, and I'm from New Orleans, so I got sent to basically cover Hurricane Katrina aftermath for 1.5 years in New Orleans. So I didn't do it then. So we'll see. I'm still, fascinated by the subjects. And I was maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I was up at Electric Boat, where they make submarines, and I'd ask the Navy if I could go on one of the submarines at Groton. And so the XO of the submarine, just right there in pier, was giving me a tour. And he says, so you wrote Blind Man's Bluff? And I said, yeah. And he says, now this is the XO, right? And he says, yeah, I read it back in high school and it was really great. That's why I'm in submarines, which was wonderful. But of course, it made me feel old, right? Here's the XO, read it in high school.
Wow. I'm sure you've retained all of the recordings. I'm assuming you recorded all your interviews, and I'm curious if there's ever been the thought of, could you make those, like put those into a website as a digital archive to basically complement and refresh the book itself.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, I do have a lot of those, and both the Naval Submarine League, which is an officers group, and the submarine veterans, when we were doing the book, I would go to all their conventions and talk to people. And the Submarine League puts out the Submarine Review, and so I've thought about giving them some transcripts, for their quarterly publication. And in fact, I have all that in my storage room with an air conditioner unit in it in the garage, and my wife has been pressing me to get in there this summer and clean things up. So I've been thinking about that recently. It's just most of the interviews are on those little mini cassette tapes.
Yeah.
And we wrote the book in like WordPerfect or something like that. And so getting that material back and updating it. But I agree. I mean, I've always liked oral histories, and now with podcasts and everything else, people like listening to things in ways that we didn't used to do. So I think that's a great idea. There could be some really fascinating stuff. So I'll see what I can do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sure that the group here would certainly enjoy listening to that. I know I would as well. Well, I know
Yeah.
we're almost headed at quarter of, and you've been very gracious in giving us a great discussion here this evening. I do want to just ask one more time, if anyone else has any additional questions, please let me know. I'm going to take a quick peek in chat as well. Let's see. Actually, we had someone just ask, is there a new future for ASW with Russia now sending ships back to Cuba? And I know Steve Cloak had mentioned that when in our pre-meeting and all. So I don't know if you have any comments about the recent Cuban exercises at all.
I saw that we just sent a submarine there. So I guess if it persists, then there certainly would be. It's almost like the blockade that they didn't call a blockade around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Where we had subs, and ASW platforms out there. So we'll see if it persists or if it's just a momentary thing. And I saw Gwen mention the Canadian contribution, and that's a really good point. We tried to get as much as we could in the book about the British contribution, because the British subs were up in the Barents Sea alternating with US subs, on station off the Russian ports. But even though we got some of the British thing in, I've seen on Amazon over the years where some of the British readers think it's too American centric a book. But they just have to speak up and tell us more about what they did.
That's right. Yeah. I was just going to make a general comment for the P3 folks in the audience. I know the comment that was made, I think that Scott made, about the P8 now is flying lower altitude missions. And I keep thinking, wow, are they going to bring back rigging the ships? I remember that when I first learned about the P3, that just blew my mind. I mean, blowing my mind anyway, with just those low altitude runs over the surface of the ocean. But thinking about, hey, maybe the P8s are going to start rigging ships.
You
Exactly.
hope so for those young people, because that's the best part about flying them.
Yeah. Well, do they have, with all that space they have on them, is the equipment or the sensors a lot bigger and better now?
I would suggest their opticals are far better than what we had back in the day.
Yeah. Okay. Because, with the drone thing, they have the Global Hawk, which goes up high and all that, and was supposed to replace the U-2, but it never did quite replace the U-2 because it was so small they couldn't get the same quality cameras on it that the U-2 could carry. And this potentially could go the other way, right? With all that space to work with.
I predicted the P8 platform and the 737 just because of its long legs, long time, and it's the logistics. It'll be the C-135 of the remainder of this century, as far as multi-mission platforms. So,
But it was probably a good deal for Boeing, right?
well, and given their press, they need something.
At least somebody making money off of it.
I hope so.
Well, I appreciate it. And if my email is cdrew1@gmail.com. If anybody wants to reach out with any questions you didn't get to ask, or any thoughts or comments, I'm always eager to hear from people.
All right, fabulous. All right, well, I think we're going to make this a wrap then. And I did want to just remind folks of our next lecture on July 11th. Actually, we have one of our returning speakers, David Simani, that will be speaking. So definitely looking forward to that. So, and look for some announcements to come out for that. And finally, if you are in the Warminster vicinity in the Southeastern PA area, or within jumping range of the area, feel free to stop on by on July 20th in Warminster for our open house. So looking forward to that. So want to thank you all again. Thanks for coming. This was a great turnout this evening. And again, to Christopher Drew, this was fantastic. So thank you so much for regaling us with stories of SOSUS.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thanks to everybody. I enjoyed it.
All
Take
right,
care.
thanks. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.